All right. The subcommittee is called to order, and even though this will be the final Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats Subcommittee hearing for the 113th Congress, we will be discussing an important topic, the Arctic and the opportunities for America as an Arctic nation. In 2009, the House Foreign Affairs Committee held a hearing on the high north, which approached the Arctic, through which, of course, what's been happening since then is people have been only seeing this through the lens of global warming. While we all recognize that there is receding ice, the purpose of this hearing is not to debate science, whether what is taking place is part of a natural cycle, as happened so many times in the past in the Earth's history, or can be traced to humankind's use of CO2 producing internal combustion engines. The fact, whatever it is, the fact remains that the Arctic is more accessible now than it has been in decades, and Arctic policy should not be just reduced to one particular issue, especially a disagreement on why the climate is changing. I am honored that today's subcommittee hearing will be the first time Admiral Robert Papp testifies in his new role as the U.S. Special Representative for the Arctic. And I thank you for being with us today and look forward to hearing your testimony and being able to get some of the strategy that you're going to be laying down and some of your perceptions of which way we should go. As the Arctic geography has changed, new opportunities have emerged, and those are the opportunities to access deposits of oil, natural gas, and other minerals. Additionally, Arctic sea lanes have become passable for increasingly longer periods of time during the summer months, cutting around 4,000 miles off the distance required to sail between Asia and Europe. A version of the long-sought Northwest Passage may be materializing right before our eyes. The increased activity has challenged the governments of Arctic nations to effectively govern the high north, build new infrastructure, and expand capabilities to operate in such harsh conditions. To help realize some of these new opportunities, the 8 Arctic countries, including the United States, created a high-level diplomatic forum called the Arctic Council. In April of 2015, it will be America's turn to assume the rotating chairmanship of this council for 2 years. This will give our government the ability to set an agenda, just in time, Admiral. Today, the subcommittee will hear key details about what will be on that agenda, how to prioritize, and what priorities we should have, which ones will serve our national interest and promote responsible development. Let me just note that there are 50,000 Americans who live in the Arctic, but this is much more than just a local issue for Alaskans. The vast resources of the Arctic can and should be wisely promoted and used to increase our prosperity and the well-being of our people. If the Arctic nations can do this successfully, so can we. Our government's role is to ensure private industry follows the rules and uses good practices, but not to block progress. We should all be mindful that other Arctic nations are seeking ways to use the Arctic for their own advantage. Chinese scholars, for example, have taken to calling China a near-Arctic state. Chinese military officials have commented that China has an indispensable role to play in the Arctic. Well, if we don't put in place effective policies for the Arctic and then follow through on those policies, we know who is waiting in the wings to fill the void. We also cannot ignore Russia's prominent role in the Arctic. And while the Russian relationship with the transatlantic community is at its lowest point since I was elected to Congress, since 1989. We should not ignore the possibility of a productive relationship with Russia in this polar region. It perhaps, let me put it this way, we can cooperate with people like this even though we have disagreements with them. And maybe by cooperating in those areas, maybe we can overcome some of those other challenges. Lastly, I want to hold this hearing now to let our friends and allies in the Arctic Council know that their cooperation and their collaboration on key projects is being noticed and appreciated on Capitol Hill. It was also important to hold this hearing before the U.S. chairmanship began to take place, to lay down some clear benchmarks and some of the metrics that we can use to judge whether or not your chairmanship and our leadership is actually accomplishing the goals we want it to accomplish. So I thank all the witnesses for being with us today. We will have two panels. The first, as I say, was Special Representative Papp, and the second, panel of private experts. Without objection, all members will have till the end of this week to submit additional written questions or extraneous material for the record. And I now would like to have Mr. Keating, our ranking member, give his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this meeting, last one of the year, and it's been a pleasure working with you during this period. And it's very thoughtful of you to have this meeting at this time, talking about the North Pole area at a time of year when so many millions of children are anxiously awaiting this. Now, I must concede that there's an element of skepticism about this, but as you said, you're not a person that believes in scientific evidence, so anything is possible.
That is good.
And for the benefit of my staff, that was not written in my notes. So, and Admiral Papp, it's been a pleasure working with you as I have on Coast Guard issues. I have so many Coast Guard stations in my district, and thank you for your service there. And thank you for sharing your first opportunity to testify before Congress in your new capacity. It's an honor to have you here today. Across the Arctic, many challenges are faced by those living and working in the North. These challenges include higher living costs, skilled labor shortages, the ramifications of climate change and other black carbon phenomena, and harsher weather conditions, to name just a few. Yet, in these challenges lie immense opportunities to coordinate efforts, increase outreach, and to make potentially life-altering scientific discoveries. It's these common challenges and experience that demonstrate why the Arctic Council is necessary and why your position, Admiral, will be so critical as the United States prepares to chair the Council. By bringing together the 8 countries bordering the Arctic, various stakeholders, NGOs, and businesses, the Arctic Council can engage in a dialogue that enables cooperative strategies to tackle common problems. The Arctic Council can serve as a forum for dialogue, even as tensions exist in other areas amongst members. That being said, I believe that a lack of transparency in certain behaviors may also raise questions. In this regard, I'll be interested in your thoughts on how to ensure peaceful cooperation, particularly given the recent increase in Russian long-range aviation, i.e. strategic bombers, and in over the Arctic and Russia's plans to establish a new military command and bases in the Arctic. These plans seem to belie Russian assertions that their interests are strictly peaceful. There are, of course, a plethora of examples of cooperation through the Council. For example, under Canada's leadership, the Council empowered Northerners with its focus on the indigenous population of the North, their traditions, and their knowledge. Canada's promotion of the Arctic Council is something that can move this region forward while also maintaining the unique landscape and the environment. Sweden and the U.S. are also working together on a partnership on Arctic resilience and the effect of changing ecosystems. And as this is occurring, the U.S. continues to partner with Finland, Iceland, Denmark, Norway, and Russia, and other members to coordinate on search and rescue efforts, monitoring vessel traffic, oil pollution preparedness, and of course, integral climate change initiatives. As these operations move forward through the Council, the North will inevitably be more interconnected, and we can learn from each other, particularly as the U.S. Coast Guard prepares to visit countries like Finland in March to examine Arctic acquisitions and bring back the knowledge to the U.S. Finally, Mr. Chairman, Admiral Papp, and I'd like to thank you for including climate change in the U.S. National Arctic Strategy, as well as for the U.S. chairmanships of the Arctic Council. It's a huge step for us, and one that I know has been recognized by proponents of the environment worldwide, and for that I thank Secretary Kerry, and I thank you, Admiral Papp. I yield back.
Thank you very much. And we also have with us Congressman Larson from Washington. And if you'd like to make an opening statement, feel free.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to be waved on for a brief time onto the subcommittee in order to participate in today's hearing. I really do appreciate that, and I'll be brief. My colleague Don Young and I created the U.S. Congressional Working Group on the Arctic a few months back, sort of bring some attention, highlight some of the issues that we see in the Arctic that are important for U.S. policy. A lot of times, the Arctic is seen as out of sight and out of mind to many, but for we in the Northwest, it's certainly part of kind of the everyday economy. Probably more so for my colleague, Mr. Young, from Alaska, but my district and the Puget Sound as a whole tends to be the winter home for a lot of people who have activities and employment in Alaska over the spring, summer, and fall, including the major fishing industry fleet headquartered basically in the Seattle Puget Sound area, as well as a lot of the shipyards doing work in the Puget Sound, supporting that activity, and as well with the potential of leases, oil and gas leases in the U.S. portion of the Arctic. A lot of those companies are looking to Puget Sound to be their winter home for maintenance and repair. But there are other issues. It's not just economic. There's environmental issues, national security issues, as well as the concerns and rights of Native peoples that ought to be on the U.S. agenda for Admiral Papp as the Arctic Council gets together. I got involved with this in part because my district is the either the first or second closest to Alaska in Washington State, up there in the northwest corner of the lower 48. But also being on the Coast Guard Committee and working with Admiral Papp and his predecessors on the icebreaker issue introduced me to these broader issues in the Arctic. So we've got a real strong interest in what occurs there. And I won't speak on behalf of Congressman Young, who was here before votes, but I do appreciate his willingness to allow somebody who's not from Alaska to be interested in the Arctic. Our Alaskan friends are very protective of what happens there, and we want to be supportive of that. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Admiral Robert Papp is the State Department's first special representative for the Arctic, having been appointed in July of this year by Secretary Kerry. Before his current position, he was the 24th Commandant of the Coast Guard, the good guy branch of the services. That's we Californians, we all love the Coast Guard, and especially the surfers love the Coast Guard. Okay, he has held numerous important positions while serving our nation, including commanding 4 different Coast Guard ships. He is a graduate of the Coast Guard Academy and holds advanced degrees, including from the Naval War College. Admiral, you may proceed with your statement. We would hope that you could summarize in a 5-minute summary for us, and then we will have questions for you, and if you may proceed.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Keating, good to see you, and Mr. Larson, good to see you again, as always, and thanks for having me here this afternoon to speak a little bit about the Arctic. I really appreciate the opportunity. When I heard that the theme was to be the United States as an Arctic nation, I was very pleased because the importance and recognition of that concept could not be more timely for all of us. As you mentioned, there are only 8 nations in the world whose territory above the Arctic Circle gives them the right to claim being an Arctic nation. The United States is one although it's been my experience that Americans do not embrace or fully understand the concept of being an Arctic nation. And that's unlike what I've observed in the other 7 Arctic countries. We hope through our chairmanship to be able to raise the awareness for all Americans. The story of the Arctic is defined by intense and arduous relationships between humans and the environment. Arctic residents, including more than 50,000 of our fellow U.S. citizens, know not just how to survive, but also how to thrive in the harshest of conditions on the Earth. Theirs is a story of continuous adaptation and survival. Today, however, the harsh and challenging environment is transforming at an unparalleled rate. Average seasonal temperatures in the Arctic are rising twice as fast as the rest of the world. And though the region seems remote to most Americans, last month we watched as the entire country experienced abnormal weather, the result of a storm that passed through the Bering Sea, creating that weather phenomenon which we've known to be called the polar vortex. And this is just one illustration of how things happening in the Arctic are not only impacting the rest of the United States, but the rest of the world. Melting glaciers and land-based ice sheets are contributing to rising sea levels and threatening some of our coastlines and cities. The future of America is inextricably linked to the future of the Arctic and will undoubtedly include increasing maritime commerce, exploration, and management of resources. In line with the President's commitment to elevate Arctic issues in our nation's foreign policy, Secretary Kerry appointed me in July to serve as the country's first special representative for the Arctic. And I gratefully accepted that responsibility and welcomed the opportunity to advance the Arctic discussion in our government and with American citizens. The Arctic Council chairmanship agenda is an important part of that discussion, and it will provide the international stage upon which we can promote our priorities. But there are many other issues at play, some on the world stage as we navigate our relationships with countries like Russia and China, and others that will require domestic action at home. As a former Commandant of the Coast Guard, I have extensive experience working in northern waters, especially in Alaska, where I began my Coast Guard career as a young ensign assigned to a cutter homeported in Adak in the Aleutian Islands. During that assignment, I crossed the Arctic Circle for the first time almost 40 years ago. Later, I toured Alaska extensively during each of my 4 years as Commandant. In my new role as Special Representative, I've already been to Alaska twice to see and hear firsthand from the people living in our rapidly changing Arctic region. Now, while I'm a sailor and not a scientist, over the course of my lifetime, I've observed firsthand the dramatic changes that are taking place in this incredible region. While the natural environment is changing at an accelerated pace, the geopolitical situation is changing quickly as well and must be taken into account. Russia's continued violations of Ukraine's sovereignty are an affront to rules-based international system. The United States has joined the international community, including the other Arctic nations, in opposing these violations and imposing costs on Russia for its actions. Nevertheless, the Arctic has been a zone of cooperation and free of conflict. We will continue to work with Russia on global issues related to the Arctic through our multilateral engagement at the Arctic Council. We remain cognizant of how changes in the Arctic have created significant challenges and opportunities for every Arctic nation. The warming climate threatens traditional ways of life for indigenous peoples and wildlife, but it also opens up new opportunities for maritime trade and prosperity, new shipping routes, increased oil and gas exploration, and tourism, to name a few. The challenge of charting a course towards a sustainable future in the Arctic is important to all of us. The State Department is committed to working within our abilities to improve the future of this region. The Arctic is quickly becoming a global cornerstone for scientific and academic research, trade, and tourism. 4 million people live across a region that crosses 24 time zones. Some areas are incredibly developed, while parts of our own American Arctic are struggling to provide the basic necessities like clean water and affordable energy. The United States will have the opportunity to address some of these Arctic challenges as we take over chair of the Arctic Council this April. Considering my appointment began in late July, my first months on the job have been spent getting out and talking to a wide range of constituent groups, both domestically and internationally, while making preparations for a chairmanship agenda that will generate forward-leaning, actionable goals and quantifiable results. Our leadership of the Arctic Council will focus on 3 primary initiatives. First, Arctic Ocean safety, security, and stewardship. Second, improving the economic and living conditions of the people of the North. And third, addressing the impacts of climate change. We're currently discussing our proposed program with the Arctic states and the permanent participants who represent the indigenous groups, and we hope to have their full support prior to our chairmanship. Our themes reflect some of the most important issues in the region. Arctic Ocean's accessibility is increasing, and a maritime nation's first responsibility is to ensure that any activity taking place off its shores is safe, secure, and environmentally responsible. To do so requires a delicate balance, but affords secure and sustainable sources of food, energy, and commerce for generations to come. For many Americans residing in the Arctic, their communities are remote, and their quality of life is dependent upon northern economic activity. The cost of living is high, and not only is it difficult to find employment, but it's a challenge to obtain the basic necessities we as people need to survive. As part of our chairmanship, we aim to focus on improving local access to sources of clean water and renewable energy to address some of these vital needs. We also hope to utilize public-private partnerships as a tool to help these remote communities throughout the Arctic region to make advancements to improve their day-to-day lives. And of course, we must focus on some effort in the regional impacts of climate change and continue the Council's work to mitigate black carbon and methane emissions. As an Arctic nation and a global leader, we have an obligation to use our diplomatic, economic, and scientific resources to help those in the region find ways to adapt to a changing Arctic. We must set the bar high and pursue ambitious domestic and foreign policy agendas to address these challenges and opportunities. I have no doubt about America's ability to embrace the responsibility and succeed, and I welcome the efforts of our partners, including Alaska Natives, students, academia, private industry, state and local governments, as we focus all of our energy on this critical global issue, including the recognition that the United States is and always will be an Arctic nation. So I thank you for your interest in the Arctic, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much for that testimony. We have been joined, of course, by Don Young, one of our more famous members of Congress for his knowledge of that part of the world. And I kid you not, I've heard about him. I was elected 26 years ago, and I heard about him even then. Don, if you have an opening statement, feel free to join us. We're also joined by Steve Stockman. If you have an opening statement, please feel free, and then we will proceed with the questioning.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you. I have a written statement I'll submit for the record without objection.
Without objection, so ordered.
Just an off-the-cuff type thing, and I'm one of the few people that really lives in the Arctic, 8 miles above the Arctic Circle. And my interest in this is of course, the lack of exposure of the Arctic to the lower 48 and where we're going. And Admiral, I compliment you for your role, but keep in mind, we just finished, I believe, 6 years with another chairman from another country, and not much happened. And that concerns me, because in your testimony, you bring up some very valid points, and we'll discuss those in the questioning part of it. But, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your interest, and of course, my good friend from Washington is here and understands my interest, and he and I together are working on hopefully some solutions to some of those challenges we're faced with. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll submit this for the record, and I yield back the balance of my time.
All right. And Mr. Stockman, do you have an opening statement or a few thoughts?
No, I just quickly state that I think this is a very important area in which, as you know, could cause confrontation among many countries. And the observations you made are important, and I think that the United States needs to be, I think, more aggressive in its posture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us. We appreciate Mr. Young, Mr. Larson, who obviously have taken a very serious interest in this issue. We have what I'm planning to do as chairman. I will move forward and let Mr. Keating, our ranking member, ask his questions first. I will then go, and then we will proceed with our fellow colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Papp, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on Russia's increased use of bombers in and over the Arctic, as well as their new Arctic Military Command, which I alluded to in my opening remarks. Since the Arctic Council does not deal with political military affairs, how will the U.S. be prepared to address the lack of Russian transparency in the Arctic, and as well as the impact on the cooperation on the Arctic Council, and should NATO be lending more situational awareness to the region as well, particularly since much of the Arctic is under NATO's area of responsibility.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. That's a pretty broad topic, and I'd start off with the overflights. First and foremost, those are strategic movements and physical statements by Russia that can be interpreted a number of ways. And I would leave it up to my colleagues in the Defense Department to give probably a better assessment on that. I do get regular intelligence briefings, and I have been doing readings on all the articles I can that we get in the open press on activities along Russia's northern border. I think the construction that they have going on and their focus is partially a reflection of the fact that they've got about 4,000 miles of coastline that is opening up now. And they are stepping out smartly in terms of adding ports, search and rescue facilities. Some of these are referred to as dual-use facilities. They can be both civilian and military. I suspect if we were to build a Coast Guard base in Barrow, other people could point at us and say that we're building dual-use facilities as well. But I've been impressed with what I've seen so far in terms of their investment along that northern sea route, and rightly so, because they're going to have a significant increase of traffic there. So I think a lot of the activities are to be expected. We look at some of them with some skepticism, but on the other hand, they are right in terms of building facilities so they can provide for search and rescue, pollution response, and other things that could happen along that northern coast. As far as NATO goes, NATO's responsibilities does not stop at the Arctic Circle. It includes the Arctic as well. I think that the European Command and our NATO commander all take this into account. There's plenty of venues, whether it's the Arctic Chiefs of Defense and other things that are looking at the military security side of the equation. I think the good thing about the Arctic Council is right from its start nearly 20 years ago, we have put defense issues, military security issues off the table so that we can keep the discourse going between the 8 countries. And I think that will continue under our chairmanship.
Another follow-up to my opening remarks. In regard to the U.S. Chairmanship's priorities, as you know, permafrost on the Arctic tundra contains twice as much carbon as currently exists in the atmosphere. Over time, the thawing of this permafrost could lead to an increase in annual emissions equal to the current annual emissions of a major emitter such as China or the United States. This could greatly complicate international efforts to curb climate change. You've lived in the Arctic and been up there, as you mentioned. Could you explain in your own words what evidence of the changing climate you've seen during that time as chair of the Arctic Council? How does the United States plan to educate the public about our interest in the Arctic, including the imperative to address this kind of climate change as well?
Well, as I said, Mr. Keating, I'm not a scientist. I'm a sailor who has been in the Arctic, and I made observations. They started 40 years ago. 40 years ago, the ship that I was on got beset in the ice in the Bering Strait in July of 1976, and trying to make it to Kotzebue. I flew by helicopter into Kotzebue, and descending, there was ice as far as I could see. I went back to Kotzebue 34 years later as commandant, flying in the same time of the year, and as far as I could see, from thousands of feet in the airplane, I could see no ice. And I went back and looked. It was not an anomaly in 1976 to have that much ice, and it's not an anomaly now to have no ice. So there's been some drastic changes. But there are other things as well. I've taken time to speak to the elders in Barrow who talk about ice cellars where they've stored their whale meat for centuries, that they've dug down hundreds of feet into the permafrost. Those ice cellars are now filling up with water. They've never seen it before. My most recent visit to Barrow, their utility system was almost breached this year. There's a tunnel that runs for about 4 or 5 miles under the city, and the pumping station was relatively close to the shore. Now it's over the shore because the permafrost is thawing, and the seas that are not buffered by shore ice now ate away at the cliffs. The permafrost fell into the sea, and their pumping station was almost breached by the seas, and they've been working feverishly up there to replace the shoreline. So these are very visible things that it doesn't take a scientist to figure out things are changing. And we have some very rudimentary things, some basic food, water, shelter issues that need to be taken care of within our American Arctic.
And these areas you think the council can work on in a collaborative, the effects of it, is that going to be the focus more than the science of it?
Yes, sir. Now, the experiences around the Arctic are quite different. You know, the conditions that you find in Scandinavia, which has had open water for centuries and is much more developed and sophisticated, is different from some of the challenges that we're facing. We are literally centuries behind on our north slope in some circumstances because the water was never open before. We never worried about it. The debate over climate change, in my mind, is a moot point. It has changed, and we would not be here talking about all this if the climate had not changed. So there is going to be increased human activity, whether it's maritime or on the shore, and infrastructure, governmental functions have not caught up with where we are right now in terms of humankind starting to come to the area.
It sounds that some of the experiences of the other participating countries could be beneficial to us, where the changes might be more pronounced,
And
learning
that's
from
what
their
we're very
experience.
hopeful. Yes, sir. You know, for instance, in Scandinavia is a very rocky shoreline. They don't have to deal with permafrost, but places, particularly Canada and the United States, and in certain circumstances, Greenland, the Danish portion of our Arctic Council, have less development and increasing activities now and different geography.
Yeah, I recently had a tour of the latest asset we have with the National Science Foundation, and I can't pronounce the name of the ship. You're probably familiar with it, but I think it'll be a great resource as well, because it'll give us more opportunities for actual mobile assessment on the site. Are you familiar
It will
with it?
for research,
Yeah.
yes, sir, but in terms of accessibility, I'm sure we'll get into an icebreaker topic here at some point, but while we always welcome those assets for the government, it doesn't replace a heavy icebreaker.
Well, thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I would suggest that we must struggle as hard as we can to make sure that the Arctic is an area that reflects cooperation rather than military confrontation. And it's always easy for us to try to be fearful, and I think if there's one place that we can actually reach out and demonstrate where people can work together, even if there are some other conflict areas in the rest of the world, it's the Arctic. And especially with people from Russia, who I think share some basic, goals in their country and maybe for the Arctic as well. Let me note that when you were talking about the icebreaker in 1976, was it, that was caught in the ice? At that time, all the scientists were telling us it was global cooling, and they used that as an example of why they believed that we were entering this era of global cooling. And obviously now the scientists are saying the opposite. But what we do know is that what you described is there is a change going on. And do you know, Admiral, is there a history at all? I understand that at a time when the Vikings were there, that there was this similar changes and openings, and then they were frozen out. Is that right?
I'm not sure about the Vikings. I have done a little bit of reading about Alaska, and if you go back about 10,000 years ago, of course, there was a bridge that went between, the scientists believe there was a bridge that went between Siberia and what is now Alaska, and that's how the current natives, which have migrated over thousands of years, actually entered into Alaska and then down the western coast of North America. So things go in cycles, and we tend to see things in a short term. But
I'll ask Congressman Young about that, because he knows all about bridges.
It went somewhere.
With that said, what do you, let me tell you, one of the concerns that I have is that when we have not defined actually what we want out of the Arctic and out of that region of the world, that instead we may leave a void, and not just what I'm saying, the Chinese that I mentioned earlier on who want to share, but other powers that may want to share of the authority to control what events are going there, may try to come up with schemes that would deny the United States and those 8 countries that you're talking about the ability to keep control of the situation. I think it is in the interest of the United States to develop a plan that will define authority so that we maintain a higher level of authority, and other of those Arctic states a higher level of authority than, for example, if we would turn this over to an international body like the United Nations, which might be susceptible to countries like China that have, we know, bribe foreign officials and get votes. What is your reaction to the idea of trying to maintain authority rather than going to a total international authority in the Arctic?
I believe that all 8 nations within the Arctic Council are firm in maintaining their sovereignty over their portions of the Arctic. There are many stories about land grabs and people trying to compete for space up there. But the reality is the boundaries are fairly well defined. There are a couple little disputes here and there. And certainly as we progress, as the other 7 nations progress under the Law of the Sea Convention to outline their extended continental shelf claims, those other remaining issues will be resolved as all. You know, one area that we're concerned about is the high seas portion of the Arctic Ocean, which right now is frozen, but at some point in time will be at least open during certain portions of the year. And as the waters warm, if what the scientists are saying is correct, there'll be species of fish that will begin migrating. So one of the things that we're working in within the Arctic Council is to come up with some sort of either non-binding or binding agreement that would come up with a fisheries council program based on science that would regulate that high seas portion and allow us to control who goes in there and conducts fishing in the future. Now's the time to start working on something like that before people get up there on the high seas portion and start exploiting those resources. And the council gives us that opportunity. And you made the comment about cooperating with others. My experience is that while there are some strategic movements that Russia is conducting, and we are rightly concerned about those things, at the tactical and operational level, there's been great cooperation, and we've worked well. The Coast Guard in the 17th District in Alaska works very well with the Russian Border Guard, their counterparts. And within the Council, we have a good working relationship. I went to the Arctic Circle event in Reykjavik, Iceland, just a couple of weeks ago. I had a bilateral meeting with Arthur Chilangarov, who is the Russia's special representative for the Arctic, and I've got an upcoming trip to the Scandinavian countries, and we are including a trip to Moscow as well to talk with our counterparts there. So we are intent on keeping these lines of communication open because it is important to the safety and security of the Arctic region and to maintain its condition.
Well, thank you very much, Admiral. And Mr. Larson, would you like to proceed?
Thank you, Mr. I just wanted to say nothing forced the Vikings out. They left of their own accord because that's how we Vikings are. Admiral Papp, in May, the GAO issued a report that the U.S. had not prioritized its commitments to the Arctic Council, and it lacked sort of an organizational head. And so I was also, the report stated the State Department had only 2 employees at the time working on Arctic policy full-time. Can you update us on what the administration has done to respond to these GAO findings?
Well, first and foremost, we've appointed a special representative, and the Secretary has given me broad responsibility to manage the Arctic portfolio, the large Arctic portfolio across the State Department. I was a little concerned when I first came in about the same issues and staffing, and I think back at that point, what they were talking about is our senior Arctic official and the one person that was working with her. That staff, there was always plans to expand that staff in preparation for the Arctic Council. There's probably at least a dozen, depending on how you count them, that are associated with that right now, not even including myself. I have a staff of 4. The Arctic Council is part of my portfolio. And as you look across the State Department, part of my job has been inventorying all those people across the regional and functional bureaus who deal with the Arctic and coming up with a matrixed organization. And I say, when you do that, we probably have closer to about 24 people within the State Department that actually have Arctic responsibilities and that we can call on from time to time. In terms of prioritization of program, it is prioritized now, certainly. The first thing that I was tasked with when coming in was to review our program. And I was very pleased to find out that there was an awful lot of work that was done, and it may not have been prioritized, but there were a lot of issues out there. What we needed to do was lump them into these categories, and what I wanted to do was have those categories relate back to the National Arctic Strategy and that strategy's implementation plan. Clearly, the Arctic Ocean safety, security, and stewardship is clearly linked back to activities that are in the implementation plan that the National Security Council put out, as are many of the other things in the other 2 categories. So first process was to prioritize and organize those. Then we had to do listening sessions, so we had input of people that will be affected by it, both internationally and within Alaska. We took 2 trips up to Alaska to do our listening sessions, and then made our presentations to various NGOs and other interest groups in preparation for the Senior Arctic Officials meeting in Yellowknife, Canada, which occurred about a month ago, for our initial presentation of our program. That is being negotiated right now. The Arctic Council operates on a consensus basis, so we have to work our program. Our initial reports are, wow, that's pretty aggressive. That's a lot to do. And the primary feedback I got from most people I spoke with was they thought we were being too aggressive. When I took it to Secretary Kerry, he wanted to know, could we do more? So we probably hit the sweet spot in terms of balance, and I think we have a very good aggressive program, which is operationalizing some of the agreements that have been done in the past, like search and rescue and marine pollution prevention and response. And I'm very pleased with where we're at right now.
So the committee staff supplied sort of the org chart for the Arctic Council, and includes a list of observer countries, and the EU has applied. I know Singapore is interested. It actually is an observer country. Mongolia, Switzerland, a lot of folks getting interested in the Arctic Council. Does the administration have a thought or a feeling, an assessment about the growth of observer states at the Arctic Council and their impact?
I think we believe that the more countries that are interested and would like to participate, the better. The Arctic clearly is the responsibility of those 8 Arctic nations, but the Arctic has an impact on the rest of the world, and the rest of the world would probably like to use the Arctic, particularly if those shipping lanes free up. So I think it's our view that the more people who want to join the party, participate, and have input, the better. If they get a better understanding with what's going on, that's in our interest as well. And by the way, if you'd like to participate, then perhaps those countries can devote resources to some of the issues that we'd like to do. They can come up with some public-private ventures and other things to help us with research, projects in the Arctic. So we believe it's a good thing.
Mr. Chairman, could you indulge me in one last question? It's a yes or no. I think it might be a yes or no. Can you give us an assessment about whether the lack of U.S. involvement with the Law of the Sea Treaty helps or hurts the U.S. in the Arctic?
It hurts us. First and foremost, I would say probably hours of discussions if I didn't have to go into every bilateral meeting and respond to the first question that's out of their mouths is, why hasn't the United States acceded to the treaty? I mean, it gets monotonous that every bilateral meeting that I've attended, not just since taking this job, but over my 4 years as commandant, when you deal with another country, they are embarrassed for us because this great nation has not acceded to a treaty that nearly every other nation in the world has, the other 7 Arctic nations has. Right now, it's not hurting us greatly because we abide by most of the provisions. There will be some time in the future, I believe, that when we want to affirm our claim on extended continental shelf, we will not have standing. I mean, I guess if we want to create a navy and enforce it or something like that, we could do that, but we're a country that lives under the rule of law, and I think it's, as an example, we should be a part of that, and it would give us standing and a venue to legitimize our claims for extended continental shelf as well.
And we now are very grateful that Congressman Young has joined us because, again, let me reiterate, this man knows more about the natural resources of Alaska, both fish and furs and
Whales.
the whole business. And during my tenure in office, he's been an incredible source of information and inspiration. So, Congressman Young,
Thank you,
we're very
Mr.
happy to
Chairman,
have you
for
join
those
us.
kind words. Admiral, and welcome. What's your 50-year vision of the Arctic? You'll be gone and I'll be gone, but what do you see out of all this council work and meetings and stuff? What do you envision in the Arctic?
Well, first of all, good to see you again, Mr. Young, and I have benefited greatly for many years from your wisdom and guidance, and I'm humbled to be here talking about the Arctic in front of you because you've got much, much, much more experience than I do. But having said that, I have some experience, and clearly during my tenure as commandant, I put the Arctic strategy as part of what I thought was one of the most important things. And I did that because as a nation, this is not just as a Coast Guardsman or former Coast Guardsman, but as a nation, we have the opportunity to get out in advance of development. The analogy that I've used as I've gone around the world and talked to other people or around the country is I've used an analogy where I was out in Fairfax County. I've owned a home out there for 25 years, and when I first bought the home, it was surrounded by farms. But developers bought up all the farms, started building other homes, and it takes the government years to catch up in terms of roads and infrastructure and schools and other things because the government is inherently bureaucratic. The Arctic is ripe for development now, but it's also a pristine environment which we'd like to preserve. We need to come to a balance of economic development with preserving that beautiful region that we have. And
Let me interrupt.
Well-
How can you preserve something that's changing?
well, I think what you can do is you can protect the environmental quality of it.
Well, and again, I don't want to get in this climate change deal. This whole issue, I'm a flatlander. I have 57 scientists, I think the best in the world, including Russian scientists, don't agree with this whole thing. It is changing. Now, how do you preserve something that is changing? You do not. You adapt. And that's why I'm asking, what's your vision? How are we going to adapt to the changes in the Arctic, which you already said in your testimony?
Mm-hmm.
What are we going to do in the Arctic to adapt to the change?
Well, for the United States, while there are a lot of people who would like to self-actualize and come up with lofty ideas on things, the reality is we're at the base of the pyramid. We're concerned right now about food, water, and shelter issues. It's like Barrow having their utility system at risk.
Yeah,
It's like
but-
those
but,
villages that don't have fresh water and sewer.
Again, Barrow would not exist if it wasn't for the white man. It wasn't a permanent town. It exists because we discovered gas, we invested in infrastructure, they have done so themselves. And now we're going to have to adapt because you can't, if you don't, you can't preserve something and it changes. That's why I'm asking you. I'm interested in what you see. We're not going to be able to put firewalls up. We can't freeze the ground again. How do we adapt? What is your council going to talk about adapting? Yes, their conduit is possibly going to get flooded. Yes, if they have some erosion problems, yes. So what are you going to do as a council to help them adapt to what's changing? That's what I don't want just a bunch of meetings. What is your plan when you get done with this term of the United States and you're being in charge of it? What is going to be the result, and how is it going to affect 50 years down the road?
Well, in terms of adapting to what's occurring up there, we are looking at projects where we would be able to adopt some of the recommendations that have been made in the adaptation study that's been done between Sweden and the United States, see what things that have come out of that study that we might be able to pursue in terms of objectives, pursue funding. Some of these are going to ultimately come back to domestic issues and resource issues and policy issues that the United States will need to address. We're involved from the State Department side in this international body in coming up with cooperation on looking at the impacts and seeing what other countries are doing, what best practices we might be able to adopt.
Okay. Which brings me up another question, Mr. Chairman. Resource extraction is going to take place. Is that correct?
It looks likely it will.
Most likely it will do. Now, how does that a conflict with the goals of this administration and the council on climate change, the extraction of fossil fuels?
No, it's not in conflict at all. Reading the National Strategy for the Arctic and the implementation plan, it calls for sustainable development of the resources of the Arctic.
Okay, now, lastly, Mr. Admiral, I always get a kick out of it. The permafrost, I've heard that term. The permafrost is melting. What is permafrost?
Well, permafrost is an accumulation of sediment, soil, animals, other things that have accumulated there over centuries, and because of the temperature has...
Was it before it froze?
What was it before it froze?
No.
It would have been probably swamp or...
It was soil, and it grew those animals and all the other things we talk about. And I go back to the concept of change. What I don't want your council to do is get involved, and I know what you talk to the people in Barrow, I represent that area, and just the climate change issue itself. This is, you mentioned 11,000 years ago, there was no ice in the North Pole. You know, that's amazing. You know, the ice was all the way 12 million years ago, 12 million years ago, there was ice in New Mexico. It melted all the way to the North Pole. And it was before automobiles were around. Now keep that in mind, or mankind of any kind, so we don't know what melted it. But permafrost is a body of organisms, if you call it, of soil, well, it could be orgasms. If you snort enough methane, yeah, okay, you follow what I'm saying, but then it froze. It froze. And I just, you know, I get so concerned that I've seen these meetings, and I know time is up, council meetings and everything else, and we'll talk and we'll talk and we'll talk, because you haven't answered that first question. What is your vision where the Arctic's going to be 50 years from now? I will give the Coast Guard credit. They do put out some shipping channels. They just did that this week, which is good.
I probably should reassert a little chairmanship authority here. Although the conversation is getting kind of hot.
No, I sit here and I've been through this so many years and listened to talk with no goal in position.
Okay, let's give the Admiral 60 seconds to answer that question, and then Steve Stockman would have his time for questions.
Well, the vision I personally would have for 50 years from now is there will probably be sustainable development. There will be extracting oil and gas from the offshore region, whether it's the extended continental shelf or closer to shore. I would see new connections to the pipeline, probably innovations in terms of renewable energy and natural energy for the residents of the Arctic and the north part of Alaska. Clearly, we are extracting a large percentage of the oil that we use in this country comes from Alaska, yet your Alaskans pay the highest prices for fuel in the country, and most of them rely upon diesel. So we need to have some innovative solutions to power for people in Northern Alaska, and I foresee that happening, whether it's wind power, thermal, wave-generated, hydropower, new solutions for power, and providing clean water for the people of the North. There are going to be a lot of people that are interested in tourism. In 2016, there's going to be a cruise ship with 1,200 passengers that's going to go leave from our west coast, go through around Alaska, and making ports of call up there. Even though there are no ports to pull into, they'll run boats ashore. But I see an increase in shipping up there. There'll be a need for permanent bases on the North Slope, not just seasonal things that the Coast Guard and other agencies do, but there'll have to be a permanent presence up there. All these things are going to require investment by our country, investment that we have not done yet, but is looming out there. I talked about how Russia is investing along its North Sea route. We're going to have to do very similar things.
And Admiral, it should have been the first answer you gave for where your vision was. You were skirting the vision, so that last answer was good. So thank you.
Sir.
And Mr. Stockman.
Some may ask why I'm here, because I'm from Houston, Texas, where we do have global warming around the year. They say we have two seasons, waiting for summer and summer, which is pretty hot down there at this time of year, even now. But in my district, we have 87 refineries. We produce almost half the gasoline in the United States. I have the Port of Houston. And so oil and gas is a very, very important commodity to our district. And what happens around the world impacts directly in our district. Therefore, I'm interested in what you had to say today and interested in the dynamics. I was told that the Department of Homeland Security was calling for more icebreakers. I think 3 heavy ones, 3 medium ones. Currently, we don't have anywhere near that. And I was wondering, do you have a vision, as Don was saying, of where we're going? Is this administration going to execute what was recommended to them in terms of icebreakers? Are you going to increase the number of icebreakers? I think I was reading the paper one time where we had to get help from other countries even. There's one that was, remember, it was frozen, and then they kept sending other icebreakers, and it kept freezing the other icebreakers, which is amazing for how that passage was supposed to be open, but it wasn't. Could you address those concerns that the other committees here have in reference to the icebreakers?
Yes, sir. My public statements are record on that, even though there's a new commandant who may have a different opinion. I don't think his opinion would be too varied from what mine has been, but in this job as well, it's my opinion that we are woefully inadequate in terms of national icebreakers. We have only one. Russia, on the other hand, granted they have a much longer coastline, but they've got at least a dozen, 6 nuclear-powered heavy icebreakers. And what I would say also is that a reminder that we're just not focused on the Arctic. We're a bipolar nation, literally. We also have Antarctic responsibilities as well, and we've got one icebreaker that can probably operate about half the year and then has to go in the shipyard because of the rough usage. We do have a medium icebreaker, the Healy, that can operate. But
that's decommissioned or not, or is that operating? That's a medium one, or is that a large?
Healy is a medium icebreaker and is about 14 years old. It's in pretty good shape, and it's used primarily for Arctic research. Polar Star is the only heavy icebreaker that we have. Its sister, Polar Sea, is laid up in mothballs in Seattle. What we have been trying to do is get construction on a brand new icebreaker to replace Polar Sea and Polar Star, which are approaching 40 years of age each.
Can I ask you what the goals are and what's the impediment to those goals?
It's money. It's new construction. In theory, right now, it should be within the Coast Guard's budget to build those, but it was denied for many years, and they're involved in other projects, and it's like the rest of the federal government. There's no growth. And a new icebreaker costs somewhere between $800 and $1 million and $1 billion, and is hard for any agency in the government to absorb right now.
But didn't Canada have, they're buying an icebreaker and they bought like the plans from another country and that saved them a lot of money?
Well, that's not unusual. When our shipbuilders in this country, oftentimes what they'll do is they will buy plans from another country. Even Navy ships or Coast Guard cutters, oftentimes they'll buy a design from another country, but then build it in the United States. Our laws require us to build it in the United States. Canada, I think they got their design from Finland, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Finland is probably the leading country for icebreakers.
But I'm saying, could we emulate what Canada did in order to facilitate expediting these icebreakers? I think is pretty important, given that your vision of increased activity, you'd probably want more icebreakers. And if that's the case, and we could save money by buying it from Finland, I would think that we should do that. So I guess, Mr. Chairman, what he's suggesting is we should bring back earmarks. That's my opinion on that. But thank you so much for coming out today. And I would just request that there be something you can tell us to do to increase make sure that the additional icebreakers could happen. You can tell us in Congress what we need to do. As long as we had oil getting out of it, we'd be very happy.
Appreciate your testimony. We appreciate your service. I'm speaking for my ranking members, the other members of the committee here. Our doors are open to you in your new chairmanship. Let us work with you. I take this responsibility very seriously because I believe that the Arctic area is an area that people have not paid attention to, the vast potential that could be available to the people of the United States and these other countries, and yes, the world, if we have the right kind of policies, if we try not to be in a conflict there, but instead try to find ground rules that will actually fit all the countries and respect each other's rights. And thank you very much for testifying, and we have another panel now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having me here today.
God bless. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a fairly lively hearing so far. We have with us two witnesses, Dr. Scott Borgensen, or go person. How do you pronounce that for me, please? Borgerson, got it. Dr. Scott Borgerson, who is the co-founder of an organization called the Arctic Circle, a prominent NGO, and he is also the Chief Executive Officer of Cargo Metrics Technologies. He has previously been a visiting fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and has written numerous scholarly articles on the Arctic. He is a former Coast Guard officer. Did they allow you to have the beard in the Coast Guard? Isn't that something? Okay. And having graduated from the Coast Guard Academy, and later he earned his PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. We also have with us Mr. Andrew Holland. He is a senior fellow at the American Security Project. His work focuses on energy, infrastructure, and the environment. In the past, he's held various policy staff positions on both sides of Capitol Hill. He is a graduate of Wake Forest University and the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Gentlemen, we'd like you to, if you could, summarize your testimony in about 5 minutes, and then be able to go, and we'll have questions for you after that. You may submit anything else, of course, for the record. You may proceed.
there is the opposite policies, and it's dark at night. And I think when you look at the Arctic in 50 years, you'll see some countries like Russia and Norway having vibrant, bright coastlines with vibrant communities and economies and industries because they're investing in infrastructure today. And if the United States does not, you'll see something that looks like North Korea today from space. What Alaska is today, which is basically open, wild coastline. From Adak to Barrow is the same distance as from about Key West to Maine. It's a massive state. Everything's bigger in Texas, of course, except for Alaska, which is 2.5 times the size of Texas. And there is virtually no infrastructure there. And we have to invest in infrastructure today. So I'll summarize my comments very briefly into first, climate change, just touching at the wave tops. Second, infrastructure, I think we need to invest there. And lastly, I think some foreign policy opportunities for the United States in chairmanship of the Arctic Council. First, climate change. 5 years ago, when I testified, I talked about the rapid pace of sea ice melt then, and the 5 years since. Every year is a record or a near record. In the past 30 years, the Arctic has lost half of its area and 3/4 of its volume of sea ice. These are historic, unprecedented melting of sea ice. It's without debate, as we've discussed on this panel. I'm a big fan of Alaska. My heart's in Alaska. I love the state. I'm in constant contact with people there, including my friend Dan Sullivan, who is now a senator elect from Alaska. And this is one of the warmest Novembers ever there. And winter is 2 months behind. The rivers have not yet frozen. So we can talk about mitigation strategies, and I personally believe carbon needs to be priced, whether it's tax or cap and trade. But it's separate from the point of this hearing, which is about adaptation. The Arctic is melting. The United States has to respond because the rest of the country or world is. Second, infrastructure. So what might we do? I'd ask you to channel your Lee Kuan Yew, the great Singaporean leader, who, when they left Malaysia in 1965, had relatively little infrastructure and a small economy. And it's now the wealthiest nation in Southeast Asia because of very forward-looking, progressive ideas about how to invest into the port, into rail, road, etc. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times 10 years ago, the first op-ed about the Arctic, saying that it would take 10 years and $1 billion to build a new icebreaker. And if we started today, this was 10 years ago, that we might have one when we need it as the polar sea and polar star are being decommissioned. As we just heard from our ambassador, here we are literally 10 years later with not a nickel appropriated to build a new one. And this country needs to. It's late. We need a deep water port. We need road, rail, and other intermodal infrastructure. We need pipelines. We need airports, etc. I would really encourage the committee to think big about Alaska and think big about the Arctic. Lastly, we need to be much, much bolder in our approach to Arctic foreign policy. I don't think we're being bold enough as we approach chairmanship of the Arctic Council. Starting with, before I suggest some new ideas, an old one is get off the list of Syria, North Korea, and Iran as non-signatories as coastal states of the Law of the Sea Convention, and join officially, I know this is the House, not the Senate, which has constitutional authority to give advice and consent to treaties, but it's embarrassing that we don't yet are officially party to the treaty. I think we should create marine preserves in the Arctic. I think we should work through the Arctic Council to help protect the high seas and maybe perhaps even make all the high seas off limits. I think we should work with Canada to create a new compromise in the Northwest Passage. We have a maritime boundary line dispute with Canada there. I think we should engage energetically with Russia. And lastly, I see I'm about out of time. I am pro-development. I think this should be done hand in hand with development. I think there should be a strategic approach to the Arctic where we look to invest in infrastructure in the Arctic and develop the Arctic with conservation in mind, but do so in a very progressive, forward-looking way that also protects the environment. Thank you.
Doctor, Mr. Holland, you may proceed.
Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Keating, and members of the committee for inviting me to testify at today's hearing. I'm going to begin by noting that I cannot claim to be an expert on Arctic affairs. Though I've written and spoken extensively about it, I've not yet been above the Arctic Circle, unlike some of our folks who've spent time on Coast Guard cutters or Navy submarines. My research at ASP focuses on energy, the environment, and how they affect America's national security. What that means is that I care more about geopolitics than I do about polar bear habitats. I think my role in today's hearing will be to offer a perspective as an outsider, someone who understands international relations and America's national security needs more than I understand the intricacies of how the Arctic Council works. So to back up, for most of human history, the annual melt and refreezing of the Arctic Ocean was a consistent trend that kept it closed to all but the most intrepid explorers. It was only in 1909 that Admiral Robert Peary's expedition became the first to reach the North Pole. In a telegram to then President Howard Taft, he said, "I have the honor to place the North Pole at your disposal." Taft replied, "Thanks for your interesting and generous offer. I do not know exactly what to do with it." As I will explain, I think that American policy to the Arctic has not changed that much since Taft. We still do not know exactly what to do with it. So today, melting ice is opening the Arctic. As we heard, the administration has made climate change in the Arctic a focus of the U.S. Arctic Council chairmanship, and that should certainly be a part of it. The unraveling of the Arctic will have huge costs to all of us, but I'm concerned that U.S. policies must go further in planning for an opening Arctic. During question and answer time, I'm happy to discuss commercial Arctic shipping, Arctic cruises, drilling for energy resources. My statement for the record includes extensive analysis of these. But I'll concentrate my oral statement on the geopolitical and military imbalances I see in the Arctic. At first glance, there is a clear storyline here. A gold rush leads to a 21st century scramble for the Arctic with contested territorial claims, which leads inexorably to conflict. But that does not fit. The institutions governing the Arctic are simply too strong. UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and the Arctic Council have legitimacy among Arctic nations, and cooperation has reigned for decades. That does not mean, however, that there's no threat of conflict over the Arctic. I contend that the danger, in fact, comes from an imbalance of attention and of power. Put simply, the United States is weak where others are gaining in strength. We are way behind our competitors in planning for an open Arctic. And this imbalance is most apparent in the military power available in the Arctic. As the region warms and the ice melts, Arctic nations are constructing new military bases and building new ships that can operate in the harsh environment. At the same time, countries far from the Arctic, including the two most populous nations in the world, China and India, are scrambling to find new geopolitical advantages in the melting ice. While countries like Russia see Arctic power as central to their national affairs, the United States pays little more than lip service to our status as an Arctic power. In nowhere else in the world is the U.S. Navy so clearly outclassed in its ability to perform surface operations as in the Arctic. Russia's Northern Fleet is its largest and most powerful. It has conducted extensive exercises in Arctic waters. Russia has reopened Cold War-era bases all along their Arctic coast. And just 2 months ago, they opened new radar bases on Wrangel Island, and that's only 300 miles from the Alaska coast. That means that the Russian military would be much closer to any drilling operations in American waters than any U.S. military or Coast Guard operations. Today, neither the Navy nor the Coast Guard have the infrastructure, the ships, or the political ambition to be able to sustain surface operations in the Arctic in a similar manner to the Russians. Reading the Department of Defense 2013 Arctic Strategy, you come away with the impression that it is a worthy document, but there's no budget to back it up. Regardless of the why the U.S. has failed to act in the Arctic, the result is a missed opportunity. The U.S. government, under the leadership of both Republican and Democratic administrations, has all but ignored the Arctic. So we must do more. In the harsh environment of the Arctic, a laissez-faire approach does not work. Governments must put in place the policies, appropriate the funds, and give the political legitimacy to Arctic development in order to exploit the real opportunities that are available up there. So far, the United States has notably combined only tentative policies with very little funding and no high-level political visibility. So I have a few concrete steps that Congress could quickly take in order to exert power in the Arctic. First, and I know it's on the other side of the hill, ratify UN Law of the Sea Convention. Second, increase funding for U.S. military presence. This is about Coast Guards, but it's also about port facilities. It's also about permanent Coast Guard facilities. Third, we need to make a final decision on whether to approve and regulate offshore oil drilling. We need to decide one way or the other, and then get moving on figuring out regulations. Fourth, elevate Admiral Papp or his successor's role to a permanent Senate-confirmed ambassador-level position. Right now, he's just a special envoy appointed to the Secretary of State. It would be better if he was an ambassador. Other nations have Arctic ambassadors. All the other Arctic nations, as well as the Chinese, the Indians, Singapore, others. And fifth, and finally, raise the Arctic's profile by regularly participating in Arctic-focused events. And by that, I mean members of Congress, not just Representative Young. We need to raise its profile. And I know I'm over time, but I'll finish up here by saying, in the absence of clear statements of policy backed by high-level attention and resources from the United States, there is a danger over the long run that other countries will misread U.S. intentions about what we perceive as our core interests in the Arctic. The United States is an Arctic nation, but we should start acting like one. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Keating, would you like to proceed?
Well, thank you, and thank you for your testimony. I do think you addressed some of the unanswered questions we had with the Admiral. I do want to give you the opportunity, I guess for Scott, and if you'd like to, you both addressed it, but if you had some time to go a little further, I'm curious, our inability to accede to the Law of the Seas Convention. What are some of the results of that, if you could detail them a little bit more? I think that would be helpful. Give you a little more time to do that.
Sure, I'll start. First, I'd like to say I was fabulous testimony, I thought, from Mr. Holland, and I agree with every one of his policy recommendations. When at the Council on Foreign Relations, I published a special report called The National Interest in Law of the Sea, which detailed all the reasons why hurting the convention, or why not joining the convention hurts specific concrete aspects of our national interest. This isn't sort of a airy-fairy feel-good thing about international treaties. This is about national interest, hard power, and a few examples. One, under the provision, Article 76 of the Convention, without being officially party, you can't formally submit your claim to extended continental shelf. Not only can we not submit our claim, we can't officially have a seat at the table to review other claims that are being submitted. That's a problem. We literally don't have U.S. representation on that committee. Second, under Article 234, which has to do with additional legal authority to enforce shipping rules and regulations in ice-covered waters, that is undermined by not being party to the treaty. And then lastly, and it's difficult to sort of quantify, but Admiral Papp sort of spoke to it, and I feel this also traveling the world, talking about the Arctic and interacting with other Arctic sovereign heads of state. We have really little lessons or moral authority on Arctic issues. The law that we led the writing of the Law of the Sea Convention. The world changed the Law of the Sea Convention to address President Reagan's problems with it. The rest of the world has signed up for the rule book that we follow, and yet still, as a great maritime nation such as ours, we still can't get our act together and join the convention. And it does undermine us from a moral and diplomatic point of view in all these forums. So I refer you to the book I wrote, National Interest in Law of the Sea, for a stimulating read on all the sort of other legal details. But I'll just end by saying it's the one issue in Washington that you can find the oil and gas industry, heads of the militaries, environmental NGOs, Republicans, Democrats across the aisle agreeing that we should join this treaty.
I would just add that the only thing, it's about legitimacy, and it's about our ability to exert our will up there. The Russians made headlines last decade in 2007 by planting a little Russian flag on the seafloor under the Arctic, and that's a part of their claim to an extended continental shelf. The Canadians have now claimed a similar thing, claiming the North Pole. The Danes through Greenland have also claimed up to the North Pole. I don't know whether we could or we would want to or anything like that, but I would note that when I was doing my research for this, Admiral Perry was the first one to put a flag up there, and it was an American flag.
You know, it's interesting. The chair and myself went to Russia. It was prior to the aggression in Ukraine and other areas. But we were in Russia, and we had the occasion to meet with Mr. Rogozin. And during that meeting, I was impressed with how much time he spent talking about their plans in oil exploration, and as the ice was melting, and how that offered all kinds of opportunities. So I think it is clear that our country is almost adopted. It might be too severe to say an isolationist policy, but clearly one of not paying attention to the economic issues, some of the jurisdictional issues that are going to come about, some of the environmental issues, oil fishing. That you could go on and on with it's clear, and that's why I hope this hearing raises the consciousness around this, because we'll be dealing with this one way or another at a certain period of time, and we can deal with it before some of these conflicts occur, before some of these opportunities are lost, before our ability to influence things diminishes, or we can wait, and all those things will occur. So I thank you both for your testimony, very important points, and I hope it raises the level of interest in this, because it's inevitable that we'll be dealing with all of these issues. We'd be better served as a country doing it in the front end. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Let me just ask some specifics here. I've heard a lot about the Law of the Sea Treaty here. I was not necessarily prepared to discuss the Law of the Sea Treaty, but would the Law of the Sea Treaty be contradictory then? You mentioned, I guess you just mentioned, or maybe you just mentioned, that one country had made a claim. Was it Denmark that made the claim all the way to the pole?
The Russians and the Canadians. The Canadians
Russians
are
and the
preparing
Canadians
their
have
claim
made
to the
claims,
pole.
territorial claims that go all the way to the pole in the sort of pie
Yeah, like a pie piece.
piece. So that is one approach that we have to setting out a strategy of how to approach who has authority and rights and power over those areas in the Arctic that we're talking about. Is there a conflict between the Law of the Sea Treaty and the idea of a territorial claim by individual countries? If we claimed then a pie shaped to the pole, would the Law of the Sea Treaty then be contrary to that?
So I'll take that. The answer is no. And the treaty actually outlines the rules under which the adjudication would be made under a organization called the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, which has a very technical, prescribed set of rules to make that determination. And
Do we, at that point, rely on the United Nations in order to settle disputes then within that context?
so maybe, not necessarily. So they can be resolved
Maybe.
bilaterally in certain circumstances.
But if they can't, but if someone comes
There's a
up,
Law of the Sea Tribunal.
yeah,
and
but somebody comes up and they're challenging your authority and your rights, and of course there's not going to be someone who says, well, I'll just give in to arbitration, even though this person has no rights to this particular territory.
Right.
We would then be letting the United Nations settle the dispute?
No, I mean, no different than China's allowed the United Nations to solve the Spratly Island dispute in the South China Sea, or our disagreement with Canada over the status of the Northwest Passage, or
Right.
our dispute with Canada on the maritime boundary line of the Arctic. Those
Yeah.
aren't.
Of course, in this particular case, it's a particular pie. The Spratly Islands, of course, are 200 miles from the Philippines and 800 miles from China, and maybe China would like the United Nations to settle that because they have a tendency to bribe countries in the United Nations.
I can't speak to Chinese bribery of UN member states as it relates to the Law of the Sea claims.
Well,
but
just remember, let's put it this way. If the Law of the Sea Treaty is dependent on the United Nations for any type of enforcement, what you have done is you've taken authority and put it in the hands of enforcement into an institution in which if you look at the membership of the United Nations and you look at the General Assembly, you realize that over half the nations are governed by crooks or lunatics. And we, as people who would never be elected and given authority to anything in the United States. So if the law of the sea treaty verification would in some way put us under an obligation to let the United Nations solve disputes, I think that was rather something I would not be supportive of. Let's put it that way. In terms of this is the warmest winter that Alaska has had. The question was in global warming, of course, is who causes this, is whether it's a natural phenomena or a man-made phenomenon because of CO2 being put into the air. That's the only real debate going on that issue. But we also should note that this has been the coldest winter in large portions of the United States. I mean, it's still the coldest winter they've ever had in Wisconsin and Minnesota and those places like that. So while we note that it's warmed up here, we know it's getting colder over here, and we also know that down in the Antarctic it seems to be an expansion of ice rather than a contraction. So these things indicate something about the environment of the world that's taking place. And I think it's really it's important that if indeed these changes in the world that are taking place changes the reality of the Arctic, we need to set down policy so that we don't have to worry about giving up authority to a international body that may or not be overly influenced by crooks. Frankly, that's, of course, a matter of some people have a different philosophy of how we're going to have a better world. So, that's just my point of view. With that said, I appreciate both of your testimonies today. That's been very valuable. And we...
Mr. Chairman, can I...
no,
can I
you're-
interject?
you're-
Oh, okay,
you're-
okay.
I'm not finished yet. I'm just going to say Mr. Stockman has got his chance. Then there will be closing statement from the ranking member and the chairman.
I think we may have votes pretty soon, too, so thank you for coming out today. I asked, Chairman, may I submit, for the record, the articles by Phil Schlafly from Eagle Forum on this topic? Thank you. I have a question for you. I like your ideas on development. However, I'm questioning, I mean, if I presented this to some of our environmental friends, they would have, well, to be blunt, they'd be rather upset with your position, which, by the way, I agree with. But how do you address that when you're confronted with people who have really strong feelings against everything you suggested? They want to be never touched. I mean, actually, the policies we're doing now is exactly the policies they want. And I agree with you. I think it's a tragedy to look forward and to see us, again, like you said, 10 years down the road, and you have such advanced development with Russia and other countries, and yet we're kind of stuck in the ice age. Yeah.
The
So
metaphors
how do you
on this
address
panel have
when,
been
when I
great.
come up? I'm going to come up to you and say, I'm angry at you for your positions, but I'm not.
Yeah.
How would you recommend I address that?
Okay, I'd love to answer that. If I could, though, I gotta respond to the chairman and say that there's not debate on the scientific community about
Please feel
about
free.
global warming. I mean, the debate among scientists is over. So I would refer you to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and
Let me note that just isn't true. There are 3,000.
Doesn't sound like it's over. It's still going on.
3,000 scientists who've signed a petition, most of whom are PhDs in science, that have said they disagree with that assessment. But there is a honest debate about it, and I could be wrong, and other people have trouble admitting they could be wrong.
so in answering Congressman Stockman, I come at it from the point of view of global warming is happening. The scientific community, I think, agrees. The ice is melting, and so there are two ends of the spectrum, right? There is.
I know, but I'm saying that you made a statement about development.
Yeah.
I agree with your statement on development. I'm not going to argue global warming, because if you actually go through the record of the statements by the global scientists every 2 years, including Al Gore said right now that the polar bears, we're not going to have any ice to walk on. By the way, if you want to say polar bear, stop giving hunting license to hunters to kill polar bears. We have an abundance of polar bears, and he predicted they were all going to be dead and floating in their jacuzzis or whatever. I want to address the thing on. I don't want to argue over global warming.
I'll answer.
I got someone coming to my office. They're going to be screaming at me, and I'll say, "Oh, I agree with this global warming guy who wants development." They go, "Well, that sounds contradictory. That's like jumbo shrimp."
So I'm a pragmatist, but there are jumbo shrimps. So you can't have both.
The cocktail sauce.
I'm a pragmatist in a sense that the environmental far end of that spectrum that wants to turn the Arctic into a park is not going to happen, and it isn't happening. I mean, the largest zinc mine, nickel mine, already in the Arctic. The Prudhoe Bay is in the Arctic. The Russians, especially, and others are going to develop the Arctic. So that perspective is fantasy. The other end of sort of what I call the drill baby drill crowd that wants to just develop without having rules and conservation in mind and do so in a very thoughtful, progressive, and strategic way, we know what that looks like. And I would say China, if they could do things different in terms of development with more environmental and conservation ethic in mind and turn back the clock, they would do so. So I try and take sort of a balanced approach to say, how can we smartly develop? This is an amazing opportunity for us. The Arctic is pristine and new, and here we have a chance, you have a chance as a leader to set in place a vision in which to develop it, but develop it sustainably.
Yeah, but I'm saying I want to do role reversal here. I'm arguing you come into my office and you say, I want nothing, I want that not to be developed. That is not an argument which is to a small sliver of people. That's a lot of people buy into that argument that nothing should be done. It's not a few people. There's a large number of people. I mean, we have proposals before drilling in Anwar, which I think could be extremely safe, and that's not that big of a footprint. Let's be honest; it's a huge geographic area, and the footprint was very small. And they're blowing up over that, predicting every caribou is going to die.
I don't disagree with you. I would maybe package it as part of a broader conservation effort that included things like marine protected areas and other places that would be protected, and investments in infrastructure and education, and a long list of things that you could do to have both development, but also do so with an eye to the future. You can have both.
And I would add too, the Arctic is a relatively small enclosed sea. So if the United States just stops all development, that doesn't mean the Russians will stop all development as well. And what happens there, if they have spills, if we are not, partaking in and trying to set high standards in the Arctic, if they spill, it won't stay in this Russian waters.
That doesn't disavow my point. For instance, in Florida, if you look at the line in the Gulf, it is a direct line right where Florida is. They stopped drilling. And now the Cubans, basically, the pool of oil doesn't just like, oh, it's Cuba, we got to stop. And they're going to basically stick a straw in there, and they're going to take Florida oil and able to drill out there and get it. And so that doesn't stop Cuba from drilling, but that's still, in this country, Florida's not drilling. And Cuba will. And I trust you, Cuba's not going to have the same environmental concerns or ethics as the Floridians. And you're going to see the same thing up in the Arctic Circle. I predict 10 years from now, we're still going to be in the situation we're in right here today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Keating. It's been an honor to be here today. Just to sum up, I'd say that the national security case for why we care about the Arctic is about what other countries are doing in the Arctic and what else is going on up there. We can't just retreat into a hole and put our heads under the sand on anything like this. We have to look at not only what our opponents are doing, but also what our allies are doing, and we have to support them, and we have to think about better ways to plan for the future on this. So the Arctic requires a lot of planning, a lot of foresight, and we're not doing it. So we need to do that more.
Thank you for holding this hearing, and really my compliments to the committee for thinking about the Arctic. America needs to think more about the Arctic, and as we've heard, is late to this region. If I wasn't clear before, I do believe global warming is real, but as Congressman Stockman pointed out, there's some can be perceived as contradictions in my worldview, in that I'd love to see us take a very progressive and thoughtful approach where we invest for the future, where, as you lay the Florida example, every time it rains, Miami's underwater and is working hard to pump the water out. You can't have development in South Florida that maybe then takes into account infrastructure to keep Miami from flooding, has public-private partnerships that can be with development, but also adapt to climate change, et cetera. We should take that exact same approach to the Arctic. So we should maybe leave you with the idea of manifest destiny. If we were having this hearing 150 years ago, 100 years ago, thinking about the American West, we'd be talking about there are no canals, there are no railroads, it's just wilderness. It's great in Washington, D.C. We'll never develop America's frontier. That's what Alaska is. And so 50 years from now, we might put our manifest destiny hats back on as American visionaries and develop it with a conservation ethic, and one that we'll be proud of for our children.
Well said, and we had some national parks dedicated that we're very grateful for that now. Mr. Keating, would you like to make a 1 minute, or
Yes.
whatever, however long?
No, I'll be brief. I view myself as a pragmatist, and I think the concerns Mr. Stockman brought up, the analogy I see from an environmental and growth standpoint is sustainable growth or smart growth, and that kind of planning, where there's going to be growth anyways. That's inevitable. Let's do it the right way. Let's do it in a way that complements and minimizes the effect on the environment. That's why planning ahead is so important. Also, I would suggest, too, when we're looking at the areas of the Law of the Sea Convention, we can't ignore the fact that right now, the other members, the other people that have agreed to this, they're making those decisions. They're using whatever governing authority, whether it's the United Nations or not, already. The difference with the U.S. is we're shut out of that. So we have no voice, or the lone voice in those issues. And along the same lines, it's important to be a part of that. Either you're there as a part of it or you're left out. And I've learned those things. They're being emphasized in this hearing as well. I hope the fact that we had this publicly, there's more attention and awareness to this, because there's a lot of work to do. And in the absence of that, other countries will be doing things that could potentially conflict with us, and we won't have a voice in dealing with that. And if we do, at some later juncture, it could be too late to effectuate the kind of change we need. So I appreciate your testimony.
I think that we timed this just perfectly, didn't we? I mean, I think that sounds like we have some votes coming up. Let's just say there's no disagreement about whether there's climate change. The only disagreement is whether mankind is causing it. And there are many scientists on both sides of that issue. But we are going through a period of climate change, and your testimony, how we believe that it's coming about, both of you and the Admiral earlier testifying that we are not taking the steps necessary to make sure that we are positioning ourselves so that change that's happening up in the Arctic will be to the benefit of the people of the United States and, yes, the people of the world. I would, and I appreciate the Admiral being here, and as I was very serious about, our doors are open to him. He is now going to be the head of the Arctic Council of 8 nations. So we need to make sure that, number one, rather than giving any type of authority to an international body that may be affected by other countries outside those nations, I think it would benefit us better to make sure that we establish a very cooperative relationship with those 8 nations. and which that makes more sense to me. And I really appreciate the insights both of you have given, and and the Admiral is I can't think of a better guy to have there than representing us there. So with that said, I thank you, and this hearing is now adjourned.
Yeah, you too. Yeah, that was fun.
I'm Linda Creevy. I'm in private practice. I do federal relations, particularly in Arctic, and I'm secretary of the Norwegian American Chamber